Solving Mysteries of One Piece. Today we continue with the section of Solving Mysteries of One Piece, where I gather various mysteries from the work of One Piece that have not yet been resolved and try to solve them with logic that is as close as possible to the manga. And if you have any mystery you want me to solve, leave it in the comments. Let's start with the first mystery and let's go to the Wano arc. In the Wano arc, several things happen that are absolutely key to the story. Among them, what stands out the most is obviously all the Gear 5, which has a lot of theories, a lot of future things, past things, and 1,000 things that can be discussed about it. But today we are not going to talk about this. We are going to talk about another topic that goes a bit unnoticed, which is something that indeed causes a big impression the first time you see it, but you think it will be resolved in the same arc in the future. And finally, it doesn't happen. In fact, neither in the same arc nor later, because I am including it in the video for a reason, because this has not been resolved. And at a certain point in the Wano arc, we see that 20 years are mentioned, and this is mentioned by Oden, who says some phrases about how in 20 years, people will come and will be able to liberate Wano. And this is not a phrase that applies only to Oden, but Toki says it too. And the question is, how did they know that in 20 years, Luffy and the others would come to liberate Wano? What way did they have to find out that in those 20 years they would come? How did they know? Where does that information come from? Well, it is something that still has not been resolved and we have no idea. But to try and resolve it, I think we have to analyze the phrases where this is specifically mentioned and analyze all the text. The first thing is the moment Oden says it, and he says, in 20 years, the pirates of the future will arrive in Wano, and when they do, the country must open up. Help them. This is exactly what Oden says, and obviously it's very important because it turns out to be true, but no context is given for why it happens. Now let's move on to Toki, and Toki says, in 20 years, the moonlight will come to dispel the darkness. When the dawn comes, those who have no shadows will disappear. Wano will be the dawn of the world. Again, dawn is mentioned. Again, these 20 years are mentioned, but we have no idea. We have no idea what happens with this, and it is not mentioned. It has been quite difficult for me to reach a solution that could be somewhat logical, because as I said, it is purely speculation. I have been waiting for the Elbaf arc to progress because I thought that maybe something could be revealed here, and despite the fact that a mural has been shown, which is true, that provides us with a lot of information regarding everything we have from the Void Century and everything we have from the ancient world, it is true that nothing about these 20 years is mentioned, even though it seems or could be inferred that this is a cycle. Then, let's see, let's consider the situation. How can it be that Oden has information that in 20 years they will come and liberate Wano? Oden is a person who has spent a lot of his life confined in Wano and then left to travel with Roger and Whitebeard. And in this way, discovered the world of One Piece and discovered many islands. That is, any information he might have regarding those 20 years, he probably gathered on the journey with Whitebeard and the journey with Roger. And despite having seen how he went to certain islands and been shown certain scenes, it is true that there is nothing very notable except for two moments. One of them is when he travels with Roger and they arrive in Skypiea and finally engrave the letters on the golden bell that Robin reads years later. And another part obviously is when they reach the island of Laugh-Tale, which is very important and is the most important part of the journey, and in fact, I would say it is one of the most beautiful and best things we have seen in One Piece. Like Skypiea, it seems to be a point that is indeed very old and has a lot of information, but it is quite far from the Blue Sea, so it doesn't seem to me that we can get much information about this, especially if we rely on something from Wano. So it seems quite logical to me to think that it could be something seen on Laugh-Tale, and it may be that we've already seen some hint. Obviously, I'm referring to things we've seen on the journey. For example, if Zunisha at some point knows of the prediction because he knows something from the Void Century, and Zunisha communicated it to Oden and told him, well, we haven't seen that. Perhaps it's something omitted from the journey, which would be very Oda-like, and it's probably what ends up happening. But by applying a bit of the logic of the work of One Piece, it makes a lot of sense that it is something seen in Laugh-Tale, and I will explain why. Something very important that we have seen in the Elbaf arc is the topic of the mural, as I mentioned before. So I think it is quite obvious to see that in this mural, the clearest thing we can perceive is that it seems that everything in some way might be predestined, or that it might be more or less written. We have seen the first world that tells us a story probably prior to those 800 years, the second world that likely tells us of the Void Century, and the third world that tells us something that will happen in the future, more or less understanding that it is like a kind of cycle, that there are patterns that must be more or less repeated, and that everything has a course to follow from day one of the story. So I started thinking and I said, if in Elbaf we have a mural that tells us all this, which is a mural that even the giants don't exactly remember where it comes from, since it very probably comes from the time of the Void Century, or at least that's what I inferred, I think it's quite logical to think that maybe in Laugh, Tail, which is an island that will also be closely related to the Void Century, the Ancient Kingdom, and many things may have, I don't know if a mural, but perhaps some kind of, it says glyph, explanation, book, area, however you want to see it, that tells the same thing in more detail, since it seems that what we saw in Elbaf is just a bunch of scribbles. They simply are not a very simple way of expressing and telling the story. It is something very limited by very simple drawings that seem to be made by a small child, as stated in the manga itself, and it's all very summarized in just 3 texts. So if we assume that when Roger arrived at Laugh Tale, he found very important things, it makes a lot of sense that he found this mural there, but explained much more. I don't mean that he obviously found the same mural, but maybe he found a more detailed mural, as I say, a poneglyph, something else, but it explains the information from the mural in much more detail. This is a dangerous topic because obviously when you have the theme of destiny in a work, it can turn out very well or very badly, and it's quite complicated to apply the theme of Luffy's freedom and everything that destiny could be. But well, it's something we will address in a future video. The thing is, we also have to see how Oda's patterns continue, and it's true that in Elbaf he has been giving us information little by little, in dribs and drabs, and the mural has been a breath of fresh air because it has told us many new things and has revealed things we didn't even think would be disclosed. But he continues to keep the most important details and hides the essence of the Void Century and the whole topic. So it seems to me that knowing Oda, when we reach the final island, when we reach Laugh Tale, it could be the perfect moment to reveal the detailed story in a much more concise way. This way we could see what Roger saw and understand everything that is happening. And maybe at that moment when we reach Laugh Tale and see the whole story, we might also see things from the journey of the Straw Hats. So they tell us things the Straw Hats have done, even seeing how they themselves are watching themselves finding the island of Laugh Tale, and perhaps refusing to read the end because they still have a bit of adventure left, the final battle to fight, and they don't want to know how it's going to end, which to me personally would seem incredible. So after thinking about it a lot, I think that's the most logical explanation I could come up with. As I say, Oda is a person who hides many things, so throughout the journey he could insert some dialogue we haven't seen. He could have Zunesha talking with Oden or anything, and since we haven't seen it, we have no idea. Oda is very much into these things, but assuming he might have left some clue with the whole 20 years, I think the only way Oden and Toki could know that in 20 years there would be certain people who would liberate Wano is because it was written. I don't think it's anything too crazy unless it's a hack from 3,000 years ago that was able to see the whole history of One Piece, and that it's something more or less similar. So, as I say, I think the most logical explanation is that it was something they saw in Laugh Tale, which is very similar to the mural we've seen in Elbaf, since it seems that the story of One Piece is a kind of cycle, at least with 3 worlds. But anyway, if you have a different idea, leave it in the comments and let's move on to the next mystery. With the second mystery, we have something very interesting and something that relates quite a bit to what I mentioned with the first. In the first, we mentioned that it seems the entire story of One Piece has been written from the start. The 3,000 years, the 800, the first world, the second, and the third, everything seems written, everything seems scripted. And there is a topic in One Piece that is very curious. It is a topic that needs to be analyzed, and it is that we see the theme of destiny mentioned a lot throughout the work. Certain characters mention it in isolated phrases, both more important and less important characters, but it is true that the theme of destiny is discussed. And here it is not so important who says it at certain moments throughout the work because it doesn't seem to be anything very specific, except in the case I'm going to mention, but it is also important to consider who is writing their dialogues, which is none other than Eiichiro Oda, creator of the work One Piece. So if Oda is presenting this concept of destiny multiple times and instilling it in you so that you remember, and doing one of those little plays, those little clues that Oda likes to do, then you have to ask yourself why he is doing this and why, especially, he included it at the moment I am going to explain now. And there is a moment when Luffy gets his first bounty, and we see people's reactions to Luffy with the first bounty, and they explain a bit about what they think of Luffy at that moment. Then we go to the village where Luffy has lived all his life, and we see that Makino has the poster in her hand. She is looking at the bounty, goes to see the village mayor, and says to him, "Look, Luffy is finally fulfilling his dream." And the mayor says a phrase that I find quite curious, not only because of the person he is, who is still the mayor of the village where Luffy lived, who seems like a person who might have a connection with Shanks or Luffy, because as I said, Shanks went there and obviously has to be someone who might have had a conversation with him, being the most important person in the village. Also obviously has known Luffy and probably talked about Luffy with Shanks. But also what I find more interesting is the panel, and it's what seems quite curious to me. And we see the mayor, who seems to be somewhat angry, somewhat irritated, or somewhat angry because he's squinting his eyes, and in fact, Oda draws veins on his arm to show that he's tense because he's angry. This character has never been known for being very muscular or having pronounced veins, quite the opposite. And here he seems angry. It looks like he's tensing his own muscles and he's upset. And this is when he says the phrase, "Your dream or your destiny." And in the panel, as I said, not only does he appear certainly angry, but he also appears to be drinking, or whatever it is he's drinking. And I find it quite interesting because it seems like a panel that is very focused on him. Notice there's no background, only him and the two dialogues. On the left, we have the destiny, and on the right, we have the dream. I find it quite curious the way the panel is positioned. I know I might seem a bit crazy thinking this, but it seems to me that it is a panel that Oda separates from the rest. In fact, if you look at the whole page, you can tell that part is divided from the rest. It's noticeable that the rest goes one way. This is done so that you see the panel and notice that the bottom part is different. So why does this person, who as I say is certainly important, mention their dream or destiny? As I said, it seems to me that Oda has included the idea of destiny several times. We've seen the mural in Elbap, we mentioned it in the first theory. I think there are interesting things that can be drawn about the topic of destiny. And Oda, obviously, as I say, has been incorporating it into the work and has been hitting you over the head so you don't forget. But the question here is, how much does this character know? Why does he say this about Luffy specifically? Why does he say that if he is fulfilling his dream, his destiny, does Shanks know something that we don't? In the recent revelation of the One Piece manga chapter, we have seen that Skipper Gaban tells Shanks something like he was the chosen person, or was the chosen child, or something like that, implying he had a mission to fulfill. Probably it ended up not being Shanks, and it is Luffy. So these people also seem to know things about destiny and such. So from here, I can deduce that Luffy's village mayor might know about destiny because Shanks told him, and maybe Shanks spoke with this mayor and told him, look, he explained the whole story of Roger, told him the entire story he had lived, and said, there is a person who has to free the world, and that person I thought was going to be me. In this case, Shanks. And then he would say that he finally realized that he has inherited the will of his captain. And at that moment, Shanks, in some indirect way, I want to think, gave him the fruit, gave him the Gomu Gomu, which later turns out not to be the Gomu Gomu, but the mythological Hito Hito Mogilonica. And in this way, the mayor found out everything by watching how Luffy slowly grew, became a pirate, and went out to sea. And here it would make sense for Makino to say, Luffy is fulfilling his dream, and for him to doubt if it is his dream, his destiny, and get angry, because he doesn't find it very amusing. Maybe he's not too happy about this. Seeing a person who has grown up since childhood thinking they have a dream, which is to be a pirate, and then realizing that maybe they are somewhat manipulated by Shanks, or that it is their destiny and they are not being free, might be something they don't like. In fact, maybe this is just a kind of reflection of something we will see with Luffy later on. And just think about what Luffy would feel if he found out that his entire dream was never his own. It has always been Shanks' dream, a dream that has been implanted by others. Or that it's something that greatly restricts his freedom. I think it would be an interesting arc if handled well, and I think it could be an important doubt for Luffy, and I think it would make a lot of sense if we see this and analyze other panels about destiny. In any case, I have mentioned it before, it is quite difficult to apply the theme of destiny in One Piece in a way that makes sense, especially because of the theme of freedom with Luffy and everything the work encompasses. But it seems to me that Oda has worked on it a lot from the beginning and must have some idea in his head. We will talk about this in more depth later, especially focusing on what Luffy's fate might be, but I think we need to pay a lot of attention whenever we see the word fate in One Piece. Now let's move on to the third mystery and go with something curious, and it's something that maybe people have forgotten, something people don't consider. And it's that when we start looking at the arcs we have left of One Piece, we can more or less have our things. We can talk about possibly going to Hachinosu, about maybe leaving Elbaf and being able to go to the Sky Islands again from above through what could be Elbaf's tree. This is something that has been discussed a lot. You already know that I think we will go to the moon. It also makes sense that we go to Odd Star, which is supposed to be the last island of the Grand Line, not counting Laugh Tale. Then obviously Laugh Tale as well. Then, obviously, we would have to go to Mary Joai's, maybe an arc about the revolutionaries. There are many places we have to go, and there are many islands. But when talking about this, there's something that is overlooked by 98% of people. In fact, if you know what I'm referring to, leave it in the comments right now. And what is overlooked is something that was mentioned a very long time ago, shortly after the time skip, and it's that as soon as we reunited with the rest of the Straw Hats and went straight into Fishman Island, after the whole adventure, something was left unresolved that seemed like it was going to happen there, but ultimately did not happen. And it's that Madame Charlie, who was a fortune teller completely expert and had been 100% accurate with predictions, predicted in a crystal ball that we would see a person who is supposed to be Luffy. It's true that in the anime you see the face, and in the manga you don't. That detail is important. Very important, but that there would be a person with a straw hat, or at least this silhouette you are seeing on screen, who would destroy Fishman Island. And at first it was implied that it was Luffy. Alright, what's going on with this? What's gonna happen? How is all of this gonna unfold? I have found multiple theories about this because there are many things to discuss. And of course, if we assume at first that it's Luffy, we have to go back to Fishman Island. Luffy cannot destroy Fishman Island from a distance. For now, he hasn't learned how to punch with Wi-Fi yet. Although, well, with the Haki, it's true that he's capable of hitting without touching the target, but I don't think it reaches the Fishman Island. The thing is that, obviously analyzing the panel, we see it and we might think it's Luffy. In fact, it really looks like Luffy because it's a person with a straw hat, and in fact, it seems to have Luffy's silhouette. And as I say, I'm gonna focus on the manga and not the anime. The anime is not canon, and it's not the first time they alter details that end up being contradicted by the manga. So as I say, there are many theories about this. The first of all is that there are people who say it won't be Luffy, and here is something that may sound very crazy, but could make sense. We've seen that there are people like Katarina Devon, who through her fruit is capable of adopting the faces of different people, and among them, she could adopt Luffy's face, could destroy Fishman Island, and in this way blame Luffy. Something I like. It makes sense, but for the moment it's unfeasible because Katarina Devon doesn't have Luffy's face. She hasn't touched Luffy as far as we know, so in principle it's something that is completely ruled out as of today. Another option is Bon Clay, who by the way, if someone doesn't know, is alive, but I don't see him betraying Luffy, although, well, with One Piece you never know. Another option being discussed is that the Fishman Island is indeed destroyed and Luffy goes there to help. And what Madame Charlie saw in the prediction was Luffy next to Fishman Island being destroyed, but he was trying to save it, not destroy it. Although, of course, what she saw in the vision might have affected her a bit, and her first understanding could be that, which obviously makes sense to think. And yet another option is that Luffy finally destroys Fishman Island, most likely not for something bad, but for something good, perhaps because it needs to be destroyed to save everyone, to bring everyone up if it has to be done because the red line must be brought down. The context doesn't matter much. The important thing is to know whether we need to go back there or not. And personally, I think it makes perfect sense for Luffy to destroy Fishman Island. As I said, I don't want to focus on the anime, and I won't even consider it, but it seems to me it would be too serious. Let me explain. I think it would be too serious a mistake to have shown Luffy and not his silhouette if, in the end, it's not going to be Luffy who destroys it. I mean, couldn't it be someone else with a straw hat? Because another theory is that it could be Emu with the straw hat who would destroy Fishman Island, and that's what Madame Charlie saw of someone with the straw hat on their head. Which is fine, and it seems like an interesting idea to me, but I would have to see exactly what the point of this is. Because let's see, as I say, I don't trust the anime, but it would seem like a gigantic mistake to me if you include Luffy, and then, in the end, it's not Luffy if it's something as important as this, because we're not talking about a minor detail. We are talking about the protagonist of the story, the protagonist of your work, destroying one of the most emblematic islands in the world of One Piece. So this is quite important because we are talking about something that would happen many years in the future, and care must be taken to do things right. So I would be very surprised if it is not at least someone with Luffy's appearance. Now, what does this imply? There can be several ways for Luffy to destroy Fishman Island, obviously. It may be that, as I say, he destroys it for something positive, but there is also a possibility, and that is we have recently seen in the last chapters of the Elbaf arc that Emu is capable of returning. bad is capable of controlling and turning anyone into a demon, at least from the outside. Later, when the chapters progress, I want to think that it won't be everyone, but imagine if Imu controls Luffy, Don and Reversey him controls Luffy and sends him to Fishman Island to destroy it, for whatever reason. In this way, we would have an evil Luffy, an evil Nika, who would be directly destroying the entire Fishman Island, fulfilling Madame Shirley's prediction and perhaps having to fight against Luffy or something like that. But what seems quite logical to me is that at some point the Straw Hats will have to return to Fishman Island. The only problem with this is that I don't know exactly how the plot can develop in the Order of the Islands. To return, I honestly have a very clear idea of how I would do it more simply and quickly, which is through the Sky Islands. I would go up through Elbaf, reach the Sky Islands, where I suppose there is an entrance there, because when we ascended, we were told it was not the usual entrance, but there was another entrance, most likely in Elbaf, I believe. So I would go up through the Sky Islands, and instead of having to navigate all the islands with all the problems of going back, I would go directly through the clouds that might have some much faster means of transport, or we can go more calmly. We go above having a somewhat different trip, and maybe, as I said, faster, quicker. And when we reach the red line, we fall back down and go to Fishman Island. I think it makes a lot of sense. This way we can return to Fishman Island. So the important thing is to keep in mind that indeed we are going to Fishman Island. Something catastrophic is going to happen on Fishman Island. Luffy is going to be there and the Straw Hats too, so we're going to have a little trip back there. Then maybe they'll give us some teleportation fruit with increased range like the one Van Augur has, but 1,000. And they teleport us, and that's it. But I think an arc through the Sky Islands, quick and lasting a couple of episodes to go to Fishman Island again, could be quite interesting. But a great deal of context is needed. We move on to the fourth mystery, and we go with something that Oda seems to have insisted on. Leave us wanting more for a long time. And in the Wano arc, more or less, we were shown the character of Rocks was revealed to us, and we were told about everything that happened in God Valley. They told us there was a war there, that Roger and Garp fought against Rocks, and that it was an incredible mess. The thing is that later on, we have seen a bit more of God Valley. Not much more. Don't think that Oda felt like drawing and showing us much history, but we've seen that it wasn't quite like that. That there was a hunt, that there were the Divine Knights, that they were doing bad things in that place, and that they were hunting people. Then Rocks arrived, Roger arrived, and, well, things began to happen there. So from all this, we can draw certain theories. And first of all, Oda does not want to show us what happened there. I have said many times that I highly doubt we will see the God Valley fight in the manga. And if we see it in the anime, it will be partly filler or something like that to stretch a scene in the anime. But I find it quite difficult for them to draw the whole fight. And this is for a very simple reason, which is that Oda does not like drawing fights. In fact, I always say it, but analyze the One Piece manga and you will see that there are no complete fights involving people who are not the Straw Hats. In fact, if you think about it, maybe the most complete ones could be something like Blackbeard against Ace. And it's not even complete because it cuts in the middle of the fight and it's practically over. Then we have another one, which is Kuzan against Garp, and it's not very complete either, just a couple of punches and that's it, but it's not a complete fight that it focuses on and all that. So it's clear that Oda doesn't like drawing fights. He just makes his manga, and if he has to draw one, then he does it. Creating Gear 5 is simply for that reason, because he doesn't want to draw fights, and thus he makes them a bit different, as he said. So starting from the fact that we are not going to see the fights, what happened in God Valley? That is the mystery I'm going to try to solve today, and I think this is precisely important. If Oda doesn't want to show us God Valley, it's not just because of the fight, but because something important happened there. And I mean, he has already shown us a couple of things. He has shown us that there were slaves. He has shown us that the God Knights were there. He has shown us that Roger was there, that Rocks was there, that Garp was there. We know the basics, but we do not know the end. It is said that Island disappeared into the sea and that its name was erased from history. But why could this be? Maybe there are more things that we cannot discuss, or things we do not know, right? And of course, it's hard for me to think, and I say, if on this island were the Holy Knights, and today in Elbaf we also have the Holy Knights, something similar might happen. In fact, there is an important dialogue that I find interesting, and there is a moment when Skopper Gaban, when he senses Imu's Haki, says, "That Haki is," and then he falls silent. It implies that the Haki seems familiar to him, that it draws his attention. I've seen people say that the Haki is very powerful, and that's why Skopper Gaban is surprised. Yes, but it seems odd to me that he doesn't finish the sentence. Otherwise, he would say, that Haki is very powerful, or what a powerful Haki. It implies that he recognizes it, like it seems familiar to him. So I have been thinking, and I believe it makes a lot of sense, that he might have felt this Haki before on the island of God Valley. And it is that there we had the Divine Knights, and if we have seen that Imu is capable of manifesting through the Divine Knights, if we have that Imu was on an island where his Divine Knights were, and there were Rox and Roger, who were the pirates that could cause him the most trouble, even if Garp was there, whom I imagine was like collateral damage for them. In fact, he probably faced some of them, the Sacred Knights, there in God Valley. I think it makes quite a bit of sense to think that Imu used his power at God Valley. Moreover, he probably applied Donny Reversi to several people. I'm not saying it was applied to the crew members of Rox, Roger, or others, but perhaps it was applied to certain soldiers who were there, to the citizens themselves, maybe even enhancing the power of the Sacred Knights. And of course, imagine that what really happened in God Valley was that Imu used all his power to control half the island, to have an incredible army of people very difficult to defeat, increasing their powers tenfold or whatever it may be, which is what we have seen he did in Elbaf or something like that, and that it was filled with very, very powerful people. On top of that, with the Divine Knights enhanced by Emu's power, and that they faced an alliance of the crew members of Rox himself, the crew members of Roger himself, and even Garp, and it could be that some higher ranking Marines who had not fallen in the Donny Reversi. I think it would be very, very cool. And I think it also makes a lot of sense because it's a way to balance the scales between two factions, with the pirates having to unite to defeat Imu, in some way Rox perishing and disappearing with the island, which perhaps was when Imu used the Mother Flame or some weapon or something we don't know and erased the island. Because we have already seen that it happened with Lelouchia, and it is indeed true that the Mother Flame from Vegapunk was used there. But well, having the weapon, I think it makes quite a bit of sense that 40 years ago a shot could be fired and erase the island. Honestly, I think there might have been a shot left to reload. Then, this would explain Scopper Gaban's phrase. This would also explain the alliance of several people there, explaining why a story is told and then perhaps it is another. They would explain why Oda doesn't want to reveal the story to us, why the island was erased from the map, and why Rox was erased from history. Not just because of that, but because of what Imu had done. He didn't want any witnesses and knew they wouldn't believe Roger because he was the Pirate King, a title they themselves gave him later, probably to cause more fear. And Garp probably wouldn't say anything because of the kind of person he was. But in fact, as I say, notice that he has no respect for the Tenryubito or anything, so maybe that comes from something too. So for me, this makes a lot of sense and fits many things. I think it's this. I don't know if Oda will explain it at some point or not. I would love to see it and see it in detail, but I think Oda won't do it, and Oda might at most give us a panel, a page, or something like that, explaining it very briefly. They might tell us the story, perhaps narrated by Garp, perhaps showing Garp's memories, and us seeing them very briefly. But it will be something like a couple of pages or a couple of very, very brief chapters or something like that, but I think they will not focus on the fight, rather on how important the development was, people's feelings, how they erased the island, the reasons, who Rox was, and things like that. In my head, I think it makes a lot of sense. And now, let's solve the fifth mystery of today's video, and let's get straight to the point with Emma's giant hat. But here, the first thing is that I want to tell you something. Let's see, this hat has an incredible Mandela effect. People have in their heads that this hat is gigantic to the point that it could be worn by Dory or Brogy. Well, no, it seems not. In fact, if you look at the image I'm showing on the screen, in the manga, you see that it's big, but not that big. I mean, Imu being the size, let's say, of an average person, or a slightly smaller person, the hat is big, but not that big. I mean, Dory and Brogy are very exaggeratedly large, and that hat, I think, would end up being quite small for them. Then, it gives the impression that the hat is big. Very big, but I don't know if I would define it as gigantic. It's true that the term gigantic has become popular in the community, but I think the term very big fits the hat better. Anyway, let's analyze all this and see whose hat this could be. Most people, I know you are thinking right now that obviously it's very easy. This hat belongs to Joy Boy. Well, I think that's not the case, since it is true that we have seen Joy Boy in a flashback and we haven't seen his face, but we've seen him with Emmett. We can compare, and it seems he could be a human. At most, a human a little bit bigger, but I think even the hat, which I've said is not huge, seems too small for him. It doesn't give the impression that Joy Boy was big enough to have that head and that hat. Besides, it would obviously be too easy. We know Oda perfectly well, and we know how much he loves to laugh at us. Don't you think it would be too obvious if it were Joy Boy's hat? That's why I bring you a different alternative, and I think it would make a lot of sense that this hat isn't from Joy Boy, but just a trolling by Oda to make us think it's from Joy Boy. First of all, as I said, is the size of the hat. It seems to be quite large, but not excessively gigantic, so here I am going to throw out something very simple. And I believe that whoever the bearer of this hat is, as of today, we don't know them or we haven't seen them. I'm completely convinced. The idea I'm going to give you, let's see, I have two ideas that are more or less similar, but certainly different, and I think it could be someone before Joy Boy. Maybe Joy Boy was a person who had a hat, but not this one. Maybe Joy Boy was someone who came after the hat. And if this hat belongs to the first person who fought 3,000 years ago, or whatever age it was, and if it belongs to that first Nika, who is so believed in by all the giants of Elbaf and even the Buccaneers, who are also certainly larger races, and if Nika was from one of these races but also had a more considerable size, or was certainly large and had this hat, maybe, and if it wasn't Nika and it was a character that, as I say, we still don't know, and that was before Nika, then I think it makes a lot of sense. Why? Well, because as I said, this hat seems to be cryogenically frozen. If it is cryogenically frozen, I understand it is so that the straw does not rot, and because it is kept there in a chamber that probably has, I don't know, other things, bodies or something like that, but it is kept in a cryogenic chamber to preserve it, to keep it. And I think that if this hat is 3,000 years old or more, it would make sense for it to have rotted. So I think it makes sense that it is frozen. Another thing that might come to mind is that this hat doesn't properly belong to anyone, but rather to something. And we know there existed a very advanced kingdom many years ago, known as the Great Kingdom, the Ancient Kingdom, however you want to call it, but we know of its existence. And it's true we haven't seen anything from them, but we know they had great technology and were supposedly advanced people. Then, from this point, I come up with an idea. What if this hat was nothing more than something representative of that country, of that kingdom? And what if perhaps that was something they had, for example, in the center of a table, like they have the Reverie and have their symbol placed in the Reverie of the world government? They had the hat in the center of their Reverie, and it was something that the world government extracted from there. The Ancient Kingdom? What if they copied the Reverie from there because they themselves did the same with other kings and in the center had the straw hat? What did it symbolize, and did they have it there? Does Imu keep the memory of having destroyed that kingdom a long time ago as a sort of trophy, and upon seeing Luffy with it, say that the hat is familiar and reminds him of this ancient kingdom? I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think it would fit that this hat belongs to no one, but to something, or as I say, to many people, as an insignia of that kingdom, and I think it has a lot of logic. This way Oda would surprise us again, because we are always thinking that this hat must belong to someone, whether it is Joy Boy or whoever. But it is true that it's always thought that that person must be someone who wears the hat, when it could be not so, it could be a symbol, and this could make a lot of sense. Well, this is kind of the idea I have right now. I believe that, as I say, there are two variables. The first is that it could be someone we don't know, someone from before Joy Boy, someone who was indeed larger, almost a giant or a very big buccaneer. And that it had, well, years ago, and that this person had the hat, and that, well, I don't know if Imu inherited it or obtained it from that moment or something like that, because Imu is supposed to come from the Void Century, but it could be from before. It's something we can't confirm or deny. But another very important option to consider, as I say, is that it's a symbol. And in this way, Imu would have deceived us all, and Oda would have deceived us all, having that as a trophy of the Ancient Kingdom from so many years ago, and a reminder that they won the war, and that it might be, well, the most prized trophy they have, something like the crown of the Ancient Kingdom, and that they simply have it, well, just as a trophy. I think it's something that makes a lot of sense. I think many things fit. I think it fits a lot with Oda. I think it fits in One Piece, that when trying to solve mysteries, the most important thing is that it fits with how the author does it and how the work is. And as I say personally, well, I think it fits perfectly for me. So leave me a bit in the comments what you think about the hat, if you have any theory or not, and that, leave it in the comments to see what you think, and leave me everything you have there to debate among yourselves in the comments, and you know I will read you. Obviously, I want to say that this type of video takes a lot of work, so if you like the video, hit the like button and subscribe, and let me know in the comments which mysteries you want me to solve in future videos.